I read from the house program that you have some personal connections to the script itself, but apart from that personal connection, is there any other reason for you to pick this play, a verbatim play for the students to work on?
Yes, there was, as always, mainly it's a pedagogical decision. Last year, for example, I had one is that thinking is impacted by very prosaic things like numbers. Last year I had a much bigger group, and I had a group of, I would say, some quite exotic talents. And so I chose an extremely challenging play. I did Thornton Wilder's masterpiece, Skin of Our Teeth. That play would not have been right for this group, both their numbers, but also I observed at this group that they had a strength, that their strength was their kind of foundation integrity. Do you know? They worked, sorry, I beg your pardon, I just bashed the microphone. That's okay. This group's strength was in their capacity to personalize and their integrity. And we have some what we would call country people, rural people from rural backgrounds, for example, in the group, and there's a real sense of a strength of honesty, which reminded me a little bit of the character of Newcastle people that I grew up with, So I thought it would be a good choice for them, and the elements of acting that are required for verbatim, I think, were played to this group's strengths. I always like to try and, my thesis about acting is that there is no one acting method, there's a different acting method for every play. And what we need to do is identify what is required of us for this play. The things that I identified last year to perform The Skin of Our Teeth with students would be completely unacceptable in doing this play. So verbatim theatre, the founding implication is that someone has said to people, tell me about your experience. And so implicit in that question are two acting techniques, if you like. One is the imagined creation of experience, the remembering of experience, and the communicating. So in my articulation of acting that I've published in my books, those two things are referred to as dimensions of history. That is, what has the character experienced that allows them to be in this moment. In this case, that's very obvious. They've experienced this traumatic event. And the dimension of communication. Tell me about your experience. Okay, I need to have experience and I need to tell. So in that way, it's a fairly refined acting process. Issues like characterization become much less significant. In fact, they could get in the way, particularly when you choose to, with the author's approval, you choose to cast cross-racially, cross-gender. Those things in this interpretation of the play become insignificant because it's human empathy and we can empathize with each other across those profiles, and so the characterization became no pretense at being or pretending to be someone other than oneself. They are young people in Adelaide today, empathizing with people 30 years ago on the other side of the country. And I use the expression narrative voice to describe the extent to which we characterize, that the reading of the text might lean toward character in the same way that a novelist will lean toward their content with their narrative voice. So that was the approach to it.
Yes, it's interesting to see you this time. For example, as you said, you use a cross-gender approach, cross-racial approach. So you in the performance, there are female students who will play the male characters. So this idea was already in your mind when you chose this play?
Yes, because I didn't see characterization as we normally understand it as being a significant thing. And I thought, in fact, that the empathy that should be at the heart of it might be underlined even more strongly by that. Mind you, I thought it was also really important that, particularly in a graduation piece where one is looking to entice the profession to employ people, I thought it was also really important that everybody has at least one character of their own gender. And secondly, really important, always very important to me, that it is not only women doing the cross-gender thing. That the only actors who don't are the two leading characters, because they only play one role essentially. But the remaining man and the remaining women all play cross-gender as well as their own gender. I have had a career in institutions where I have probably taught at least 60% women, if not 70, well, not 70, but maybe 65% women. And so I've learned early on, particularly when you look at repertoire like Shakespeare, which is, I guess, a specialization of mine, that one needs to address issues of how you cast women and what rationale you use, and one of the things that I find that I've always done is that, and that I believe, is that you need to address that problem at the heart of the play rather than at the periphery. So for example, in Singapore, when I directed Macbeth, I could easily have cast a man, but given that I was going to have women playing nominally male roles all over the play, once you cast Macbeth as a female, it breaks the shell. You know, the audience are relieved of their concern because they must accept this because it's at the centre. Yes. You know, so I've had a female Richard III and a female Richard II and so on. And they're also, they lead to such interesting experiments because those plays are so fluid and so interesting that they lead to, it's always interesting because the next premise, I would say, to the woman is that we will never deny your femininity. You'll meet this play as a woman. And with Shakespeare, that's just a whole lot of really interesting experiments when you have, for example, a female Horatio and it brings into focus the fact that every time Hamlet opens his mouth, he's declaring his love for Horatio. And so when the young woman says, how do I, if I hear that as a woman, they must be in a romantic relationship. I say, okay, well, we'll go with that. We'll explore that, you know. That seems like a long way off your questions, I'm sorry. I digress. Okay. I'm a famous digresser.
Okay, so is it the first time you pick a verbatim play for the students?
It's not the first time I programmed one, but it's the first time I've directed a verbatim play. I programmed the Laramie Project here about 8 years ago. It was directed beautifully by Geordie Brookman, the current artistic director of the State Theatre Company. And I have programmed Aftershocks at 20 years ago at Theatre Nepean, a school that I used to run, but I didn't direct either of those myself.
So, are there any particular challenges for the students in tackling verbatim plays? I think because their usual training, their training are more towards the conventional plays, Shakespeare's and conventional plays. When they did such a verbatim play, is there any, as you observe, is there any particular challenge for them?
Well, I would say that the challenge is in that identification of what elements of acting are useful that I spoke about earlier. Once you've identified that, you have identified the challenge. Once you've identified the fact that the first time through the play, I mean, my belief, I'm very strong on character history. If a character walks on stage and says, I've just seen a dogfight down the street, if that actor hasn't imagined what they've seen, I'm sitting in the audience and I say, no, you didn't. You know, I don't want to question that, what an actor tells me. So this play is all about memory. I said to them, we had a run through the first time where I said, this will be very slow and I don't care how slow it is. Let's not worry about the aesthetics of the performance, but don't open your mouth until you have an image to speak to. Don't talk about the rocks and the slabs and the building falling until you have imagined it, and describe what you have imagined. So there's a lot of what I call imaginative homework. And then coming to the stage, and so we had a couple of weeks of working where the work was not performance. So you're not acting yet, because we have to apply the aesthetic to it. This is all part of the sort of the dimensions of my, way of teaching. We're just doing the history. We're just doing memory. So just remember and speak your memories. And it was very slow and it was very soft, but it embedded the memories. Because once they're there, you can do what you like to the delivery of text. So that was something of the process. I think the greater challenge I found, so if you like, that was part of my challenge as an acting teacher, to make those identifications. But the challenge as a director was surprising and weird, because that's where normally you are looking for the dramatic transactions to determine the shape or feel or pace or spatiality of a scene. Is this a scene in which who's the predator and who's the prey, or who wins, or when do they win, and that tends to shape the spatial thinking. But when you don't have any of that, when you don't have transactions, when all of the interviews are conducted singularly, apart from the married couple who were stage left, then you're taking different cues as a director as to I was thinking and talking musically a lot. That in the music of this scene it needs to relate to the music of the previous scene in this way. So it was very intuitive. There were certain scenes where I said this should be, the foundation of the play is people talking to people. So direct, frank communication was always a kind of bedrock. But then we tilted into other more, if you like, more creative or more artistic interpretations of certain scenes. And we took certain scenes back into the moment. That we talked about a proximity to the moment, that as we remember things, are we remembering them from a distance more coolly, or is the memory taking us back into the center of the moment? So you'd have seen there are certain scenes that are as if there again, and there are others that are very reflective. So that came out of the text and the rhythms of text and things like that, and certain decisions that were just aesthetic decisions about variety, knowing that the play can work as it was originally produced. And you might have, if you've seen the text, you might have seen the photographs of the original production. Knowing the security is it can work with 6 chairs and nothing, and people just talking. Verbatim theatre can work like that. That's a great foundation, because when in doubt, as a director, you can go back to that idea. Just speak your memories, and then let the material do it. But I was also very mindful of Paul Brown's wonderful invitation to treat it as text. Not as history, but treat it as a play. And I think that one of the great things about the text is how fully he has done that as a playwright. That he has unapologetically taken the words that he's heard and built a very well-structured play from them. And he's done that with integrity and with honesty. It's very important, I think, that the text has recorded the file interview numbers of each paragraph, so you can see when he has taken a speech that happened much later and inserted it here. I think that's a really important part of the kind of, if you like, the moral contract or the ethics of verbatim theatre. And I think the ethics of verbatim theatre are complex and troubling. They are a version of history, a version of the moment, and a version of people's feelings, because just like a documentary or the telling of someone else's story, it is told through the lens of the teller. You can't avoid that. My PhD is in ethnography, so I'm fully versed in the difficulties of explaining others. And I think that Paul Brown deals with that as well as one can, by being unapologetic in his pursuit of a good play, and B, by being frank and honest in with his manipulations of text.
Because I did documentary theatre started focusing on documentary theatre a few years ago, and I did several original documentary plays in Hong Kong, and I always came across some questions like, and also I read from some articles, and sometimes it's being criticized of being talking heads, just talk and talk and talk. And sometimes I got these comments that, there are so many words in your plays, and how do you tackle this? Do you think it's a problem, or how do you tackle this?
Well, I always say that the value of talking heads is defined by the quality of what's being said. I mean, it can be talking heads, and if what's being said is fascinating enough, then that's fine. But look, you've seen from the production that I chose not to have actors sit on chairs and just talk. I chose to explore it as a theatrical text. I didn't expect to be doing that. But I said to a colleague, I did Martin Crimp's Attempts on Her Life as an actor 11 years ago. And I said to my colleague who directed that, halfway through this process, I said, I feel like I'm directing Attempts on Her Life, where you find a little theatrical play for every scene. You find a different mode of telling for every scene. So I wouldn't say that I'm certainly not afraid of talking heads. I understand that some people are impatient with that, but people's definitions of what's theatrical are very strange and very varied anyway. When in Australian theatre over the last 20 years, when people talk about theatricality, they tend to mean technical colour and light and what we call whiz-bangery, lots of whiz-bang stuff. And they tend to mean non-narrative. Now,
or popular word, post-dramatic.
Post-dramatic. But I have a wicked view about that. Don't tell anyone this. Don't tell anyone this. Not so of someone like Martin Crimp writing Attempts on Her Life. Not so of certain great pieces of work. But I believe it is so of most so-called post-dramatic, is that it is a refuse for those who can't write dramatic. That writing, unless it is for social purpose, unless it's a political or social purpose, so I exclude verbatim from that. But what some particularly early career and mid-career playwrights are loath to accept is that writing a story that coheres across 2 or 3 or 4 acts is the hardest thing to do. Yes. To write a story from beginning to end that coheres is the hardest thing to do on stage. So to write in a post-dramatic way is fundamentally easier.
It's exactly what my playwriting teacher said, that those who wrote sort of post-dramatic plays, because they just can't write it. Write the foundation ones.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the only wicked person in the world. I have friends across the seas.
And so what do you think is the relevance? Of course, I think as exercise for the students is very good, but is there any relevance to do this play again nowadays in Australia after shocks?
I would just say about the things that you said about the post-traumatic things. It's also common in Hong Kong.
It's a trend.
Yes, it's a trend that there's many plays like that. So I'll just focus on those things that are not test-wise.
I think it is even more so. It is a phenomenon in Singapore. I think also in multilingual societies, perhaps there are, and I speak as a layperson, and I'm not from such a society, but my observation of living in Singapore is that it's also to do with self-perceived deficiencies or lacks of confidence in language. That is sometimes said of Singapore that there's a shyness about complex English, and there's also a shyness about complex Mandarin, and there are all sorts of political troubles in relation to Malay, and so it's a society that struggles with what voice to use and what language to use. So maybe that plays into the fact that the theatre is almost exclusively post or perhaps pre-dramatic.
Yes. Okay. So coming back to the questions that you think, apart from being a good exercise for the students, so to put on a verbatim play aftershocks of more than 20 years ago, is there any relevance to the students, to the audience nowadays in Australia? Well,
I guess I'd unpack the question by saying that I don't lean hard on the question of social relevance, because when people do, they tend to make false claims. It tends to lead one to say, yes, it's very important that the world see this play now, and usually that's a bit of a stretch, that claim that's being made. It starts to get into a sort of marketing world that that I don't find very interesting or artistic. But that said, I think that it's a play about empathy, and I think seeing these young people empathise is, I hope, an interesting and a moving thing. It's a play about an event in history that was a significant event, and if nothing else, people come out of it. People go into it or come out of it saying, who might have been born after 1989, many of our audience said, I didn't know this had happened. So if nothing else, they've learned something. They've learnt that this event happened. Unexpectedly. And I think the other really interesting thing is that the play is, as much as it is about an earthquake, it is about a club. It is about an old Australia that doesn't exist anymore, about a workers' club. There are still buildings called workers' clubs, but they are thoroughly corporatised. The earthquake really marked the end of what that club and clubs like it were and are about. I guess some probably still remain to some extent, but they're tiny little shacks and gatherings of people probably. But the fact that this was a society, as I said in the play, a society of lefties, a society who had enemies from the conservative side of society, who had enemies in church and in politics, who were motivated and energised by the American war in Vietnam and marched on the streets, and had shared values of community. So it's a play about that community. It's a play about the workers' club as much as it's a play about an earthquake. So aside from whatever that might do or specifically impact on an audience emotionally or socially or politically, it is interesting and worthwhile to go to the theatre and learn something.
So, and I also want to ask a bit about the history of verbatim theatre in Australia. So I read from the introduction of the play, Aftershocks, and Paul Brown said there have been some community theatre works before this one that use the stories from the communities, but this one is he said probably the very first one that use most of the materials are mainly from the taped interviews, so sort of the very first verbatim play in Australia. And I see it in recent 10 years, playwrights like Elena Valentine, and there are some playwrights who are focused on the verbatim theatre plays. So is it start within these 20 years, this sort of trend, if I can call it a trend, or in Australia?
Look, I don't observe it as a trend. I don't observe it as a particular trend. And I hasten to add that I am by no means an expert in verbatim theatre. This is the first one I've ever done. I've never done it as an actor. So I don't really feel qualified to comment on that. I don't observe a trend in verbatim theatre. I do observe, no, I don't. Maybe there's a bit of a trend towards connecting new plays to specific societies and specific moments. There's a play, an excellent play, for example, having a debut season as we speak at the State Theatre Company of South Australia, called Gods of Strangers, which is a play written by a second-generation Greek Australian woman, Elena Karapetis, who did very substantial research into the first wave of Greek and Italian migrants to South Australia and their experiences. And it's a beautiful play. If you have a chance to see it, I urge you to see it. So this is not verbatim theatre, but it is based on a lot of research. And I'm sure there are many words on that stage that come from the mouths of people that Eleanor spoke to. Any good playwright is going to there are going to be words on stage that come from usually their mothers' mouths. And sometimes those things are owned up to very frankly. If you think of family plays, biographical plays, Tennessee Williams owns up to that very frankly with Glass Menagerie, because he comes on and more or less says, this is my life, this is my family. So verbatim is sometimes, you might say, a hidden mechanism, technique in playwrights' work. But I do think that there are certainly some terrific little rogue companies that grow their work directly from community experience. And more power to them. I think that's very powerful work and important work. We have a lot of unreconciled things in this country. The most glaringly obvious unreconciled thing is the relationship of the post-colonial society and European settlers to the first people of Australia remains our scar. And I think that we have a lot more work to do in the arts to continue to engage with that and respectfully hear and give voice to and give platform to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters.
One more, a bit more detailed question about how you guide the actors. So you said you didn't ask them to mimic the characters, and so you the way you guide them is you ask them to empathize, to find I can see very clearly from the production that I really appreciate that the actors, as what we discussed last night, the performance of the actors, the students' actors, are somehow better than the Hong Kong Academy for Performing Arts. Well, don't show it. Okay, and because it seems more natural to me the way they express their emotion. Then because sometimes as a student it's easy to overact, to express the emotion. But I think I didn't see this in last night's performance. So is it? I'm wondering, is it because you don't ask them to mimic the characters and you just ask them to empathize, to, as you said, to have the pictures, to have the images before they speak? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, there are two things. There's the way one approaches this play, and there's the way one approaches the teaching of acting more generally. The way to approach this play I've described. If these young actors tried to characterize more thoroughly, it would start to look like, I fear, caricature. Like they mustn't look like they're making fun of these characters, particularly as the characters are older than them and the characters are working class characters. It's very easy in any society to do, there might be certain comic plays where that's appropriate, but this isn't that kind of play. The audience needs to have empathy for the characters, and so the actors have to have respect for the characters, or for the voices of the real people whose stories they are. So that's the approach in relation to the play. But in relation to acting more generally, I think that centeredness is a quality that my students inherit from me, I hope, and I believe that I inherited from my excellent teacher, Nick Enright, now no longer with us, but a famous Australian acting teacher. that is about personalization, it is about integrity, it is about employing the integrity one seeks in life on stage, about a link between those two things. That people who are believed in life, who are read as being people of integrity, tend to use that in their acting. You know, there are certain actors you think, well, I never disbelieve you on stage because I never disbelieve you in life. You know? And so a lot of actor training, particularly when in these kinds of institutions, it's with young people who are also, at the same time that they're learning how to act, they're learning how to be adults. They're going from, you know, adolescence to adulthood. And that's a really precious and beautiful, privileged time to spend with them as a mentor and a teacher. And you're trying to thread the best qualities of acting and art into the way that they sustain their lives as well. So in practical terms, in pedagogical terms, I make the premise that acting is a combination of all sorts of things that are just like life or found in life, and then all sorts of things that are entirely artificial. And I tend to begin with the former. I begin the training by saying, let's examine the ways in which this is no more complicated than daily living your life. Now, that's not acting. It's not acting yet. But it is a recognition of that. And it tends to make people's anxieties about, oh, can I be one of these special people, to make them feel like I am enough. I am not just good enough, there is enough of me. There was one of those actors on stage in this show who I think is giving one of the most beautiful performances in the show, who has only allowed herself to accept that really this show. And she has transformed because she has finally, the penny has dropped, as we say. The penny has dropped. What I've been telling her for 3 years, she has discovered that she can be herself, and that she is enough. She's not fundamentally insufficient, you know?
That's a very beautiful thing as a teacher to see. Yes.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. I mean, it's great to look at a group of actors at the end of the two things that we've talked about throughout, that we kind of nailed it down to. This grows from remembering and telling. The remembering and telling. Imagining and telling is the acting in the show relies on faith and clarity. Your faith in the circumstances, your love for the lives and the play, and the clarity with which you tell it. And faith and clarity has become, I guess, our kind of call to each other about not just, and of course, it's a way of that extends beyond this to any play, faith and clarity, you know.